this installment of Brave New World on ContextTV. So in the past few days, I've been having a lot of conversations with decision makers at different organizations who are basically asking themselves, well, when is normal going to come back? What is the road to normalcy and what does that look like? I'd like to just start off by saying, obviously, I'm not a doctor, so I'm not here to discuss the need for testing, how and when humans will develop antibodies, or obviously, the road and the timeline to having a vaccine. We're going to let that to the experts. But it's important to kind of just say, look, if you are an employee or if you're a decision maker in an industry, in a sector of the economy that's been affected, to kind of just look at this, break it down in a practical way to think, well, where am I in the waves and phases of this so-called return? Because I think everybody gets it, that it's not a flip of a switch where we say, okay, everything is fine now, everything can kind of resume. So let's start off by looking at the number one wild card when we look at the workforce, which is, well, if you are an individual that has kids, you can only really get back to work before even asking yourself if your company and your industry is back, if there's some place for you to send your kids, realistically. So unless you have schools and day camps fully functioning, I just don't see how a big chunk of the workforce can just expect to get back to normal. And even though kids are more immune to COVID, they are probably just as likely to transmit it. So if little Joey goes to camp and is playing with Michelle, and then Michelle goes home and gives it to his and her parents, well, then obviously that won't be a good thing. So that's one of the two wild cards. And then you could say, okay, well, maybe the other portion of the workforce that doesn't have kids may be the first to get back to work, with already over 10 million filing for unemployment in the U.S. There's going to be this dislocation and this kind of rapid acceleration where certain industries are going to evolve, certain companies are just not going to come back. The structure of certain businesses and just literally the physical layout of them are going to change, which takes us to the first space I want to look at, which is retail. So clearly, essential services have remained functional, stores, pharmacies, and whatnot. But let's take a look at malls, for example. So malls already have been under tremendous pressure under the risks that Amazon has ushered. Even a dominant retail company like Walmart has had to dramatically change the way that they view their operations. But I think for sure, if you take a non-essential brand or service like The Gap, The Gap is probably going to change the way that they view things. If until now the VP of retail got the big budgets and the attention of the CEO and the CFO to get the big dollars to go and open up a new store in Times Square or it's a mall, clearly I think that will not be the case going forward. Maybe Joseph now is going to get the attention because Joseph just needs a fraction of that for e-commerce, for online fulfillment, for digital advertising and whatnot. Two, I think, within the retail, I think a lot of stores are just going to change the way they see things. If you're a quick service restaurant, maybe you're going to reconfigure your stores going forward, where there's a lot more of an emphasis on pickup and delivery versus eating in. Same thing if you're a pharmacy, selling toilet paper or whatever, you may just reconfigure and rethink the way you set up your shops so that people can order online and then just maybe show up and pick it up, where somebody just puts it in their trunk instead of necessarily going into stores. And I think the smartest executives are already thinking about this. And frankly, I think many of them were already considering these things, but the optics of, well, we can't replace employees, human beings with automation is unsavory because it may reduce employment. I think COVID makes that somewhat moot. The second bucket that I want to jump to is education. Scott Galloway had a great article which actually recapped a lot of what I said in my article previously, which was, look, online education has been growing for the last decade, and this will just accelerate that trend. But I think more importantly, COVID totally shatters the myth that you have to go to school. You've already seen this entire century where kids have been forced basically to believe this myth that you needed a higher education degree, and even if that means going into debt, but then you come out of your education and there's not necessarily the jobs maybe that you were expecting that will offset and justify the high cost of getting that degree. So I think what this will do is it will dramatically reshape the landscape. I think a lot of the smartest colleges will maybe put a bit more emphasis on online education. You know, he has some kind of more out there ideas where like Google will combine their strengths with Stanford and give some, you know, but it could happen, anything could happen. But clearly the bottom line is you're not going to get 100 students, 100 18-year-olds packing into a classroom to listen to a teacher to, you know, subject themselves to the risk of getting infected with COVID come September. So I think those plans that a lot of these higher learning institutions had, they're coming to the forefront much faster. Obviously, we work in media and entertainment. We obviously have, you know, everything, you know, you've seen it's the golden era of television. Television's been affected. There's so much to untangle there. I may do a follow-up on just the media world. But let's look at, you know, movies, feature films. I think historically, economic incentives for these big, high-budget tentpole releases, think Marvel, think Batman, think Top Gun, that really only makes sense if you can get consumers to put their butts in seats in theaters, pack a theater, pay $20, $30, popcorn, parking, babysitter. It's a high ticket expense commitment, but that's what makes the Top Gun, the big budgets make sense. Clearly, I think historically a lot of movie execs were like, well, maybe we should put these movies on our streaming platform, direct to consumer, SVOD, you know, or pay per view. But they didn't want to do that to disrupt the relationship that they had with theaters. That is over. Theaters will again probably not open in the same way in the summer, probably not the fall. So I think some of the hesitation that movie execs had to burn bridges and relationships with people who work at the AMCs of the world, I think that will be gone. By necessity, you're just going to see this massive shift where theaters are just not going to open. For the hotels and the resorts are a wild card because I think if it's leisure, clearly that's not going to happen. Nobody needs right now to go to a resort. But even hotels, I think a lot of business travel will be questioned. This year, a lot of CFOs, to cut costs, are going to say, well, we don't have that travel, that meal, entertainment expense. And I think that a lot of the travel that people historically would take for work, they're going to question that and say, could this just be a phone call? Could this be a Zoom or a Skype or a Hangouts meeting? And I think the answer to that is yes. And I also think that a lot of individuals are just not going to want to take the risk of flying 100, 200 flights a year because people are going to have, you know, the risk of a pandemic is no longer going to be limited to a TED Talk or a Watch Mojo Top 10 Ways to Survive a Pandemic. It's actually going to be a real thing. It will no longer be something that we hear about in Asia, contained in China. We will have experienced it, and even if people forget, you know, they will still be a bit more realistic about the risks of that. The next one is conventions. So clearly, there's a lot of events, that conferences that, you know, will just simply not take place this year. And even if the risk were to go down, I think realistically, if you work for these industries, you should probably be very proactive about reinventing yourself. If you have always, for example, wanted to develop video programming, but you've put that on the shelves, but now, because you always focused on your conferences, well, maybe you could have these virtual seminars that you record. That gives you video programming, so you could take a negative, a threat, and turn it into an opportunity. But again, I just think realistically, the optics are weird to put on an event that you expect people to pay tickets to go if they just let go hundreds, if not thousands of employees, or they just furloughed people, or they're taking pay cuts. So I think you have to expect 2020 to be a year where, you know, very few conferences will take place unless they're really at the tail end. And then I think pragmatically, even if health-wise it's fine and people want to schedule events in the second half of the year, there's just going to be a scheduling bottleneck. If there was, you know, the Anaheim Convention Center that hosts VidCon, you know, if that was going to take place in June, but now there's nothing happening in Anaheim Convention Center until, let's say, September 1st, every event throughout the year is going to be kind of crammed in September, October, November, and that's just not physically possible. So I think if you're in the convention business, unfortunately, you may be forced to reinvent yourself much faster. I skipped the cruises because I wanted to talk first about conventions, because if hotels are not functional, well then, you know, nobody's going to go to a convention. But let's not skip cruises for a second. So cruises and airplanes are kind of all related. I think The airlines are going to undergo a tremendous economic challenge to just survive until they get there. It is plausible to nationalize them. It is plausible that they just merge. I don't think between now and, say, September 1st, let alone later, American, Delta, and all the different airlines in the US alone, let alone elsewhere, can survive just keeping the airplanes grounded, supporting staff and whatnot. So I think they're going to have to get very creative with the government. But ultimately, unless the airlines are functional, then it's not like the conventions are going to be able to take place, right? So there's this domino effect. And same thing with cruises. I think a lot of the cruise companies are giving these crazy offers to their clients to basically just accept a credit next year. So you are seeing bookings for the next year, but I think that's more of like a gimmick because people are basically not going on any cruises now. And then I think there's a stigma. How likely is it that cruises are not going to be associated with pandemics and the health risk? And then ultimately, if a lot of consumers are going to be seeing their 401ks down, their stock portfolios down in value, losing jobs, well, they're going to have less discretionary income, and cruises are probably, while relatively speaking, a cheap way to travel the world, they're obviously not going to be as much demand for them. So that's another industry. Last but not least is this whole live entertainment. Again, the dominoes effects, how everything is related. Sports, probably the one thing that still makes advertising on TV hum along. There's no live sports. So TV on advertising is going to take a hit and probably flow to digital advertising when it comes back, and I'm going to cover that in a separate video. But live sports and live concerts, so think the Live Nations or think the MSGs and all that, I think they're in a unique pickle because they are the last in line in this path to normalcy. If you are an executive, you don't want your legacy to be that, yeah, we rushed back to put on a concert or a sports event, and then people came from the region or the nation or from different places to partake in this festival or sporting event, and then they got sick and infected. It seems crazy that any owner would want their legacy to be the 1918 Philadelphia Spanish flu parade. And then in terms of sports, again, unless there is a vaccine and unless they develop antibodies, or there's testing on the fly where you walk in, you go through a metal detector to make sure you don't got your gun, but you also get your temperature checked, or I don't know how it would work, I'm not a doctor, but unless you have like on-the-spot testing, well, I don't see people wanting to crowd into an arena, and I also don't necessarily see athletes who would want to take the risk and whatnot. So if you are in the live sports, live entertainment business, I think unfortunately you are frozen, you're in a state of paralysis, but you also can't seem insensitive. You're probably a billionaire owner to begin with that is not only not essential, but has to wait in line. Whereas like historically we've seen the cult of the celebrity, it's the opposite now, where there's a lot of more essential or less non-essential industries and services that need to get back and hum along well without the risk of a comeback of COVID before you get in line. So ultimately, I do think that the doctors, are going to be working on the testing and the vaccines necessary. And that's why, and only that's why, without both the testing and vaccines there, I just don't see a return to normalcy. And this is going to be, sadly, a lot longer than shorter. So that's basically how I see things getting back to normal in waves over time, unless miraculously we have the testing and the vaccine in place like that.